Hi guys, it's Mary McIntyre. Welcome back to my channel. In this video I'm going to talk you through some solar photography tips, specifically to do with the upcoming total eclipse that's happening on the 8th of April. I've had quite a few people comment or message me asking if I'm going to kind of put anything out to help people with some tips on how to photograph the eclipse. I've photographed quite a few partial eclipses from the UK. I've only ever actually witnessed one total eclipse in 2017 in the USA. So what I'm going to do in this video is talk you through how we planned those shots, the cameras we used, how we went about taking those pictures, show you the results of that. But I also want to talk about how to do stuff telescopically. So I will talk you through how to do afocal photography, how to do prime focus photography with a telescope with filters, and also with a hydrogen alpha solar telescope. So there's going to be kind of quite a lot in this video, but what I'll do is I will timestamp everything and put it in the description box. So if you're only interested in one particular part of this, you'll be able to find it really quickly. What I'll do at the end is talk about things that I think we will do differently next time. And I do a lot of solar photography, white light and H alpha, so I've got a good handle on how to get pictures of the sun. But when it comes to like the intricacies of a total eclipse and the panic around how fast totality happens, we've only had one experience of that, but we did plan really well, and I think the results for our very first time actually came out really well. And there isn't a massive amount I'd change in terms of settings, so hopefully it will be helpful for you, and I'll have some tips on kind of visual observing as well. So as I say, timestamps for everything will be in the description box below. Don't forget to hit like and share this video with anybody who may want some tips as well, and I will be covering safety aspects as part of this, which is super important. So let's get started. Okay, so to start off with, I'm going to talk you through how we actually photographed the total eclipse in 2017. Now, we were traveling from the UK, so we didn't take telescopes. So all of the photography that we did for the eclipse was just with digital SLRs, but we used 4 of them and used different focal lengths in order to take the pictures that we did. So I'm going to talk you through how we kind of went about planning that, and then kind of talk you through the settings and the kinds of things that we did to achieve the results that we did. Now, before we went away, we were kind of looking up a lot of advice online, and the general consensus was, if this is your first time seeing a total eclipse, don't try to photograph it, just enjoy it. And we were kind of like, well, no. We did deliberately make things as simple as possible with regards to the photography, so we could stop what we were doing and actually look as well. So I did put the cameras down for the final 60 seconds and just look with my eyes, and I'm really glad I did that. I didn't want to experience it all through a viewfinder, but I would have been devastated if I'd got home and not had pictures. So there was no way that we were ever going to go all that distance for our very first solar eclipse on our honeymoon and not take photographs. It was just never an option for us. It may be for you that you are happy to just see it visually, but I just think it's nice to have a little something to remind you of that special event. So the first thing we did before we were going to go away is make our solar filters. So we bought the solar certified Astro film, and from that we made filters for our digital SLRs. You can use the same stuff to make filters for telescopes, but we were just taking our camera lenses. And the crucial thing was that we had a lot of equipment to take in terms of cameras and not very much luggage space. So they had to be something that was foldable and robust. So the design that we went for was this. So my husband and I both made one. I'll let you guess which is mine. I took the trouble of painting mine just to make it look nicer. So what we did is used some old Amazon packaging, 2 squares of that, cut out a square of solar film and stuck that down, sandwiched it in between, but then we had these kind of fins coming out that were snipped kind of like a star. So basically they were flat pack, and then when they're wrapped around the camera lens, we held them on really tightly with that double-sided Velcro that sticks to itself no matter which way around you stick it. So that was the plan, and this meant that we could fold them flat. They basically fitted into an envelope. So this was the design that we'd seen online. It was just lots of these little tabs. I didn't cut mine particularly evenly, but it didn't matter. The important thing was they were able to fold flat, fit into an envelope. We put a little bit of foam packaging there to protect that filter, because there's even one tiny mark on that film. You can't risk using it. It's just not worth it. So that's what we did for that. And it meant that they were able to fold up really nice and tight. Mark's actually folded in slightly differently from mine, but it was just really useful to be able to flat pack them and then take up minimal amount of space in our luggage. We arrived there on the Saturday, late on Saturday night. The eclipse was Monday morning, and we were going to have to get up in the early hours and drive for 3.5 hours to Glendale State Park. So if this filter had got damaged in transit, there is no way that we would have been able to find it on a Sunday, one of the busiest Sundays as it happened, given how many people saw the eclipse. There's just no way we would have been able to replace it in time. So transporting it safely was #1 priority. This stuff is not expensive. It's about £20 for an A4 sheet, and out of that you can make several filters. So it's pretty reasonable compared to the cost of like those solar filters that you buy ready made. But yeah, that was how we did it. So that would fit on the front of a camera lens, whether it was the zoom lens or the wide field lens, and that worked really well for us. So we had 4 digital SLRs. I was looking after 2 of them. My husband, Mark, was looking after 2 of them. So one of the cameras, the first one that I was looking after was my 1100D. All the digital SLRs were 1100D, so bottom of the range budget camera. And I was using it with the 18 to 55mm lens that came with the camera, the kit lens, people sometimes refer to it. And that was on a static tripod. So what I did there is kept the camera in the same position for the entire event. I took a photograph every 5 minutes, but as soon as we got to totality, I took the filter off, then just shot on continuous. I took over 2,000 pictures during totality, and then put the filter back on again as soon as we'd seen the second diamond ring, and carried on taking a picture every 5 minutes, and then just left that for the entirety of the event. So that's how I did that. The second camera Mark was looking after, and this was an 1100D with a 300mm zoom lens, and this had a solar filter on, and this was on a Star Adventurer mount. So this mount was tracking, and the purpose of this camera was to capture the entire event through a 300mm zoom lens and be able to make a time lapse of the moon crossing in front of the sun. So the filter was on that for almost all of it, filter off during totality, filter back on again afterwards. And he took a photograph every 2 minutes for the whole 4 hours so that we could make a video of that. So 2 very different focal lengths, both capturing the entire event, one tracking, one not tracking. The reason I chose the 1855mm lens and I used 18mm focal length is that in the length of time it took for the whole eclipse, the sun moved across the field of view of the lens. If I'd used a wider angle lens, I didn't actually own one then, but if I had have used one, the sun would have been so small on the sensor that you wouldn't really have seen anything. So it was that sweet spot of getting everything in one image without having to do anything fancy like stitching stuff together. So that's 2 very different things that we were doing. Same camera, different lenses, one tracking, one static. So that was the lenses that the filters that we put on the cameras. So as I said, we held it on with Velcro. You have to focus this ahead of time, and the way that I do that, because the focusing ring on a digital SLR is on the front of the camera lens, and obviously you can't get to that when this filter is in place. So the way that I do that is to have the filter back to front, make sure it's covering. It's easier to get 2 of you to do this, actually, to make sure that you keep the lens fully covered by the filter at all times, and then manually adjust the focus until you've got it right, because automatic focus is not going to work for you doing this. So that's how we did the focus, and then very, very carefully put the filter on so that we don't knock the focus. It's tricky. It is tricky when you're using this sort of filter that are held on that way, but yeah, just make sure that that filter can't blow off as well. Make sure it's on nice and firm. So the third camera was Mark's one with the 300mm mirror lens. So he wanted a bit of a longer focal length to use primarily during totality. So no solar filter on here. This was just being used to take photographs of the corona. And so 500 millimeters just gets you zoomed in that little bit more and able to capture a bit more detail kind of around the limb, looking at prominences and stuff like that. So that came out just during totality. And equally, camera number 4 was my other 1100D with a 300mm zoom lens doing the same thing. Now, the idea was that this was going to be on this little tabletop tripod on the roof of our hire car. We could only fit 3 tripods in our luggage. So this takes up very little space. I had it in my hand baggage, but they upgraded our hire car when they saw my mobility scooter and I couldn't reach the roof of the car. So all of my totality pictures were actually handheld. But because the sun is bright, even during totality, you don't need super long exposures. So you can get away with handheld. So if you haven't got a tripod or you can't take one with you, don't let that stop you trying this. If you keep your shutter speed short, you will still capture something. So yeah, this zoom lens came out just during totality, no filter on. So that was the 4 digital SLRs. We were also kind of randomly taking pictures with bridge cameras and phone cameras as well. But the main kind of, we want to capture all of this stuff of the Eclipse was those 4 digital SLRs. So yeah, considering we were told not to bother photographing the first one, we stuck to just 4 digital SLRs, but it was stressful looking after all 4 of them and trying to capture everything. So here we are on the morning, we've got everything set up. We actually arrived there at about 6 in the morning, and so we had loads and loads of time to get everything set up. There was no way that we could reach the roof of the hire car. I think this was our one. I'm not tall enough to reach that, but the handheld worked absolutely fine anyway. If you are going away for the day to do something like this, make sure you pack all of your batteries and spare batteries. There was somebody next to us had brought a fancy telescope along and got there to find he had no batteries and couldn't power it, and it'd just be devastating. So make sure that you double check that you've got spare batteries wherever you're needing batteries to power anything. So yeah, we were just kind of waiting around, making sure everything was set up, making sure that our various cameras were not too close to each other and in danger of us kicking them or nudging them during any of that precious time that we were trying to image things. One thing that if you have a pair of Eclipse glasses, or if you have a little solar viewer like this, you can hold it up to the sun and just hold your camera up to it and take a photograph. And it's obviously the sun is very small on the camera sensor, but it works really, really well. And so you can do that with a camera. Whatever you do, do not look through binoculars and put that behind it, thinking that it will filter the light, because it will just melt the solar filter. So don't point binoculars at the sun and look that way. It's just not safe. But if you're just pointing phone camera or a bridge camera through the filter, you can get some really interesting pictures. Now, if in terms of just viewing, if you can get hold of some solar eclipse glasses, that's great. They don't magnify, but you'll be able to see the sun before you get to totality. There are people at the moment in the States that are selling these eclipse glasses for 50 times what they're actually worth. Please don't waste your money buying something that costs about $3 to produce and people are selling them for stupid money. It's really just not ethical. So you can see there are other ways you can observe the eclipse. I'm going to show you some projection methods that you can use without owning any fancy equipment. If you can get hold of these, great, but please don't let somebody completely fleece you a lot of money for a pair of these, because most people were given them for free for outreach by the wonderful people at Charlie Bates Solar Astronomy, and they're just capitalizing on that and selling them, and I just don't think that's right. But if you can get them, great. If not, if you are in the path of totality, you don't need eclipse glasses to see totality. But if you're not in the path of totality, you will need to use projection methods instead if you haven't got the eclipse glasses. So we were getting very close to first contact here at 10:24. So I was looking with my eyes, getting ready to go with my camera to start off the first exposure of my every 5 minutes thing. It was 34 degrees already by that time in the morning. temperature dropped significantly during totality, but it was such a beautiful, beautiful park. So my stepchildren came with us, even though it was our honeymoon, because they wanted to experience the eclipse too. So they were holding up eclipse glasses with their own little compact cameras and bridge cameras. So my stepdaughter and my stepson were both doing that with the eclipse glasses, trying to capture what they could of the event. And this is the kind of thing that they got. So very small, but the digital zoom on a bridge camera can kind of get you in a little bit closer. So even if all you have is one of these little plastic viewers or eclipse glasses, hold it up and just take a picture with your compact camera or your phone camera, because you will still see something. Like, that's amazing, being able to see that much of the eclipse. And during totality, this was one of the bridge camera pictures that my stepchildren took as well, without a filter. So although it is overexposed around here, obviously a compact camera is not the best at this sort of thing. You can still see the corona, and it was really beautiful and looks a little bit more like it looked to the naked eye, actually, which was really awesome. So you can do this with basic stuff to get some simple pictures. Now, if you are in the path of totality, obviously your eye is drawn to the corona, as it should be, but just stop and look around you, because it's really weird. It's like there's a 360-degree sunset going on. I put all my cameras down to just observe, and I looked around and I was like, wait, it's sunset everywhere. It's so weird. So I took out my phone camera and did a 360-degree panorama, but it brightened it so much that it wasn't really a realistic idea. This is how dark it actually got. That's a more realistic kind of light level that our eyes were seeing, but on the panoramic picture it's brightened it a lot. But seeing that red sunset near the horizon in all directions is really weird. It just doesn't look like that at sunset. It was really quite special. So make sure you do kind of look around for things like that as well. So in terms of the photos we got, this is my number one wide field camera that I talked about. So there are 37 images in this stack. So in the lead up to totality, I took a picture every 5 minutes. This was ISO 200, just for reference. Obviously, the focal length will vary how much your ISO needs to be, but all of these were 1/3200th of a second, so super, super fast shutter speed. During totality, I took the filter off and then just left the camera running on continuous at ISO 100 because the light level was that much brighter. So I did ISO 100, the fastest shutter speed that my camera did, and just kept it shooting continuously. Soon as totality was over, filter back on, then back to ISO 200 for 1/3200th of a second every 5 minutes until the whole thing was finished. Then out of the 2000 pictures I took during totality, I used these 3, just overlap them in the middle to create my whole composite image. So because these were really fast shutter speeds, there's no kind of foreground. That's one thing that in my brain I really would have liked to have had, but Glendale State Park is quite flat. It's kind of sort of undulating hills, but there's nothing really as a foreground. The sun was already pretty high by that point, so there was nothing in this field of view that would have meant I could have got foreground stuff as well, not with the framing that I did. But that said, I still really, really love this picture, and I actually stacked them using Star Stacks, the Star Trail software, because the camera hadn't moved throughout all of it, so it was easier to just throw them in there and stacked it in seconds. Trying to do 37 layers in Photoshop would have taken a considerably longer time. So yeah, I thought that turned out really well for a wide field shot. And I actually turned all of that into an animation as well. So you can see the moon slowly coming across the solar disk. And the solar disk is tiny at this focal length, but you can still see it happening. Then I used all of the pictures in the run up to totality to show how that light level just dipped down, and then there's that tiny ring of corona, and then it starts to moon starts to move away again. So I'm glad that I took as many pictures as I did during totality, because you got to see that light just kind of like somebody had turned a dimmer switch off, and that's exactly what it was like to actually observe it. So it was really, really awesome. So I got quite a lot of good stuff out of that one camera, just at an 18mm focal length. So you don't need to go kind of crazy with zoom lenses. If you do have a zoom lens though, you can do some fancier stuff. So the second camera, the one that Mark Mark was looking after that was tracking, he took 106 images. So he took a picture every 2 minutes with the filter in place. They were all ISO 400 for 1/2500th of a second. And things went a bit crazy after totality. So during totality, he changed the shutter speed to be 1/40th of a second. When he put the filter back on, one of those arms that we cut to help it to fold flat had got stuck inside, so it hadn't kind of wrapped as tightly around the lens, so there was extra light kind of bleeding in from the side. Luckily we were not looking through that, because that would have been really dangerous, but it wasn't enough light to damage the camera. But it does mean that the video goes a little bit bonkers, and there's a little bit of light flickering, but post-processing we were able to tone that down, still get a really usable video out of it. Mark did all the corrections and I made the video myself. So yeah, that was not ideal, but just if you don't like flashing lights, just be aware that the light level is going to change on this. So we were perfectly lucky with the weather. So you can see this is the whole event taken from the 300mm zoom lens perspective. It's just still gives me goosebumps looking at this. He took a few single shots, and then obviously things went all a bit awry here with the light going a bit bonkers, and then the moon moves away again. So we were still able to get a usable video out of it, even though there was that one little error there. So there's too much light getting in here really, but that still looked really cool. Now, the one that Mark was using, the mirror lens, the 500mm, it was really close-up pictures of these prominences that he was able to get. And you can see the faint corona streaming out from around here. So this was no filter. It was manually bracketing the shots. And what we mean by that is taking lots of pictures of different shutter speeds back to back. And the reason that you want to do that is to get this faint detail of the corona and the prominences near the limb around the outside of the moon. You need a really fast shutter speed, but the corona extends out 15 solar diameters. So that's really tenuous and really faint further out. So a longer shutter speed will actually pick up more of that, but it will overexpose this bit. So the idea is to take lots of different shutter speeds throughout the whole of totality and then digitally merge them all together into one image. Sounds easy. It's really not. I am not very good at doing that recombination of different exposures, but this is what Mark got. These are just single shots that haven't been merged, and you can see on this one there's way more corona, and Mark got more detail in his corona because he had an extra 200mm focal length. That's 500mm focal length is longer than our small refractor, so it really gets you in close, and the detail here is gorgeous. And seeing these arching sort of magnetic field lines around the prominence, it's just amazing, absolutely amazing. But you can see the bit really close to the limb there has managed to get kind of overexposed a little bit. So he was shooting lots of different shutter speeds during this, and he put together this kind of little collage of pictures. So moving on to camera number 4, this was my one with the 300mm lens that was handheld, and again manually bracketing my shots. So I had to do it handheld because, as I said earlier, I couldn't reach the roof of the hire car, so I couldn't use my tabletop tripod, but it worked absolutely fine. All of these were ISO 400, and the shutter speeds varied from 1/15th of a second all the way down to 1/2000th of a second. Had I had a tripod, I would have done longer, but I was extremely emotional. Everyone told me I would cry during totality. I was like, don't be ridiculous. Of course I won't cry. I sobbed like a newborn baby during totality. So trying to handhold this camera while taking pictures, while sobbing about how beautiful it all was. And, you know, all these years of planning this trip, and there we were actually seeing it. It really got to me. And I was very sleep deprived. But yeah, it was a really amazing experience, and I was trembling. I was literally trembling. So any longer than a 15th of a second, I was getting terrible camera shake. But if I had a tripod, I would have loved to have done a slightly longer exposure. But I still got some pretty epic pictures. So this is approaching the first diamond ring. So gorgeous. And you can see I do have the prominences visible there as well. During totality, these are the 3 that I used to create my kind of composite image where I've merged them all together. So these are 3 different exposures. This one obviously exposing for near the limb, this one picking up some detail a bit further out, and this one getting all this stuff right out here. But you can see that all the detail there has been lost. That's why you have to digitally merge them together. So I merged them together using Photoshop layer masks and a Gaussian blur to blend them. I was also able to digitally brighten the disk of the moon. There was a hint of earthshine. If you're not aware of what earthshine is, when you see the moon like a crescent moon, you normally just see the illuminated crescent. But sometimes if you look at it through binoculars or even naked eye, and if you take a long exposure picture, you can see that the shadow side of the moon has a gentle amount of illumination on it. That is light bouncing back from Earth, gently illuminating the lunar surface. And you can pick that up. If you do a long enough exposure during totality, you will pick up earthshine on the moon. I couldn't do a long enough exposure to pick that up because I was handheld. But I did get a hint of it. There was just a hint of something when I brought it out, and the splodges are in the right place for it to be Lunar Maria. So it's grainy and not ideal, but there is just a hint of something there. So I did really push that one probably a bit too much to try and pull that out. But now you can see that I've done the best I can at preserving detail everywhere. This is the star Regulus. It was really weird seeing stars at 10:30 in the morning. So that's, I've reprocessed this about 50 times, but you know, it doesn't matter which one of these I show, it's still kind of very similar. Considering they were handheld while I was sobbing, I was pretty pleased with that, to be honest. And this is another picture. The closest I got to Bailey's beads, actually. Bailey's beads are just at the point where you're approaching or leaving totality. Because the lunar surface is cratered, sunlight will start to appear through certain points, and it gives this illusion of a chain of beads. So these are prominences here, but these little dots here would have been Bailey's beads had I photographed them like a second earlier. But it's the closest I got, and you know, still pretty awesome to have got what we did. And then we had the diamond ring as the moon was going the other direction, and the 2 diamond rings there, and then all done. So that's the collage of all of my totality pictures that were all handheld. I still can't believe I took these, quite honestly. I did not expect to get results like this for my very first time. It was amazing. So absolutely awesome. Now, I mentioned about eclipse glasses. If you can't get hold of eclipse glasses, you can use a pinhole projection method to still observe the eclipse. You can do this really simply by just literally taking a piece of cardboard and using a map tack or a drawing pin, punch a hole in it, hold it up to the sun, and just look at the shadow, and there'll be a little white circle in the middle, and that will be the sun. And as you see the eclipse, you'll be able to see that the moon is obscuring part of that little circle. It's really tiny. It's a tiny dot, but it's still, you can see enough detail. This is how pinhole cameras used to work. So the further away your projection piece of card, like you can hold it up and then have a piece of card underneath it, you move that forward and back, you'll kind of get it looking a bit crisper. But it works. You can actually see the phases of the eclipse, the different parts of the eclipse, using that method. You can also use a colander, you know, the kind of metal sieves that have the larger holes in them. Same thing, hold it up to the sun, and then wherever the shadow is, where the holes are, you will have a gazillion tiny little pinhole cameras. So the clip, this was during a partial eclipse that we had here in the UK a few years ago, and the eclipse hadn't started yet. I was just kind of taking photographs to show you the principle of it. But during the eclipse, you could see like the moon obscuring parts of every single one of those projected images. You can even see this in dappled sunlight through trees. You quite often get, if you've got a dense tree foliage, where the sunlight comes through, you can end up with loads of little projected eclipse projections on the ground. So there are lots of ways that you can do it with nothing more than a piece of card and a drawing pin or a colander. So that's a really good way to do it, very low tech, not investing any money. You can also obviously photograph the eclipse using a telescope, and there are a few different ways of doing that. I have done partial eclipses with a telescope, but not totality. So I can't really advise on exact camera settings for totality with a telescope. But I'm guessing somewhere very similar to what I did with my zoom lens would probably work. I don't know. I can't really help with that, but I can help with just general solar photography tips because this is something I've done a lot of over the last 12 years. Now, first of all, really, really important safety thing. Never, ever, ever, ever attempt to look through a telescope or binoculars unless proper solar filtration is in place. It will permanently damage your eyes, possibly lead to blindness. And just to demonstrate, I was setting this telescope up to do some solar observing. I obviously always keep this covered, the finder scope covered, because even the magnification on the finder scope is enough to cause blindness. The back cap wasn't, the back cap was on, the front one wasn't. I thought it was, but it wasn't on. And it took approximately 2 seconds for it to burn a hole in the cap that was on the back of the finder scope. That was really sobering. It was a stupid mistake on my part to not make sure that was covered. I wasn't looking through it at the time, thankfully, but the sun just burned straight through even that tiny little, like 2 centimeter finder scope. So imagine what the full magnification of a telescope will do to your eye. Basically will burn a hole right through your retina. So just don't risk it, please. So if you don't have a camera and you want to observe the eclipse with a telescope, you can use the projection method again, a bit like we did with the pinhole camera. Keep the caps on the finder scope. I can't emphasize that strongly enough. Also, if any of the internal parts of your telescope are plastic, or if you don't know what they're made of, don't try it, because if you've got any of the lenses within the inside of your telescope that are not made of glass, this is going to get too hot and it's going to melt them. And then it's going to ruin your telescope or your eyepieces. So basically don't do this. If your eyepiece or any component of your telescope is plastic, please don't do it. The projection method, although you can do it for short periods with small aperture Newtonian reflectors or mirror telescopes, this with a mirror telescope, it's all completely open. The mirror is getting all of the full sunlight, and it can get really, really hot and divert that energy back through the eyepiece where you're projecting. So it's just not a suitable technique for large aperture reflectors because there's just too much light gathering in the mirror and it will just overheat and could be quite dangerous, potentially damage your telescope. This is also super important. If you are doing this, never leave the telescope unattended. If you've got a telescope set up to do projection and somebody doesn't know that that's what you're doing, people cannot resist looking through the eyepiece of a telescope, even if it's inside, even if it's outdoors on a cloudy, rainy day. If you've got a telescope set up, people will come to look through it, and they won't understand that you're projecting on the sun, and without the proper filtration in place, they could go blind if they look through that. So you cannot leave it untended even for a second, because somebody could go blind if they look through it. So what we've done when we do outreach events, we have an old tripod and we have a box with a piece of white card on it, and we project, and this is a small Newtonian reflector, and we just projected for short periods of time and just projected onto this piece of card that had a little bit of a hood over it just to give it a little bit of shade to make it stand out better. And that works really, really well. So you can do it with the small aperture reflectors, or you can do it with a refractor. This is my 4-inch 102mm Helios refractor, and I'm using the eyepiece with the right angled eyepiece on this. You can actually angle it down to point at wherever you want to put your clipboard. So I just used a chair on this occasion, point that right down at the clipboard with a piece of white paper on it. And then you can just take a picture of that with your phone. So the sun isn't round here because I took it at an angle, so it's kind of slightly distorted it, but you can see all of these sunspots. These sunspots were firing off so many solar flares as well. It was really amazing. So you can easily photograph the eclipse like this. It's projected onto a piece of card. The further away you put the card, the bigger the projection will be, and therefore the easier it'll be to see the sunspots and any other detail. So as the moon makes its way across, you will just have a big shadow kind of starting to engulf the sun. Really, really easy to see that way. So that hasn't involved any cameras. All it's needed is a clipboard with a white piece of paper on and somebody that is willing to babysit the telescope to make sure that nobody accidentally looks through it. Now, you can use the same principle with binoculars. You can point your binoculars up and just hold them at a piece of card, or if you have a mounting for your binoculars, you can point them at the sun again and project onto the card, but obviously not if any of the bits in your binoculars are plastic. But that's really good as well. And you get a twofer, you get two lots of solar projection there, and it immediately looks like a face when we see two of them. It just looks like eyes and a black fringe. But yeah, you can do that with binoculars as well, so you don't need a telescope. Really important, the internet is flooded with people selling these eyepiece solar filters. Please don't use them. They are so dangerous. They're not cutting out the light at the right end of the telescope. So for visual observing, you need to cut out the light before it gets into the telescope. That applies whether you're photographing through the telescope or observing visually. So putting something at the eyepiece end is not going to cut out enough light. They are dangerous. They are not safe for use. So please don't use them. What you can use is the same solar film that we made our filters from for the cameras. You can do something similar and build a solar filter for your telescope. My refractor actually has this kind of aperture mask already built in. So I just put the solar film in. It doesn't have to be stretched flat, by the way. It doesn't matter if it's a bit wrinkly and rippled. So basically sandwich that between some cardboard, make sure it's in there nice and firmly. And then when you take the little aperture cover off, you've then got a solar filter. You do not need a large aperture for the sun. It's an incredibly bright object, so even stopping my aperture down to this still gives a really great result when you do solar observing that way. So you can do it with homemade Barda solar film. You can buy ready-made filters made using the same film, but they've got locking nuts on them. They are much safer. When I'm doing any observing in an outreach situation with one of my homemade solar filters on, the previous one, that cap is really on fine. It's not going to blow off, but I duct tape it down so nobody can come and take the cap off thinking that they're helping. So I always make sure that cannot be removed accidentally. It can only be removed when I want it to be. These locking screws make sure, again, that they're nice and secure, and they come in all different apertures. We've got them for every one of our telescopes, even our 8-inch Rishi Crescent. So they lock onto the sides and bolt on, so they're nice and secure, and they are way less expensive to buy. They're more expensive than making the filter yourself, obviously, but it's less expensive than buying the glass ones. We luckily managed to pick up a 1000 Oaks glass solar filter a few years ago. I think they don't make these now, but there are other companies that do make glass filters. These are superior, but they come at a price. My husband bought this like a dozen years ago for the Venus transit. And of course, in the UK, it was cloudy everywhere, so nobody saw the Venus transit. But I've used this filter extensively over the last decade, and it's a really good filter. But equally, you can get great results with the film. So either one works. And crucially, these are sitting on the front of the telescope, blocking 99.999% of the light and keeping it safe at the business end of the telescope for you to look. Now, the other thing you can use instead of the solar filter is something called a Herschel wedge. This is not an eyepiece filter. This is an entire unit where the solar light is being blocked after it's come through the lens. So these only work on refractors, I believe. I don't actually have one, but you can put that on the end of your refractor, and then you've got this to help you as a finder scope, and then you can pop your eyepiece or your camera lens in the top there and take some photographs. A few different companies that make these, and they will give you a superior result than using the Astro solar film. More expensive again, but they are really good. So if you want to get serious about solar imaging, it's worth thinking about, but to get started, the solar film is fine. Now, in terms of photography with a telescope, if we're looking at white light filters, they are the filters that I've just talked about. First of all, there's two ways that you can do photography. First one is afocal photography, and that is where you literally hold a camera up hold it up to the eyepiece so that the camera is taking a picture through the eyepiece, that is afocal photography. You can do it with a bridge camera, you can do it with a compact camera. All of my early astro pics were done with a little compact camera like that, held on with elastic bands. But you can buy adapters that hold your phone in place and get some good results. And mobile phone cameras now are phenomenal, so you'll be able to get some really good results like that. The kind of the high res way is to do prime focus photography, and that is where you have a digital SLR, you take off the lens, you put a T-ring and an extension tube on, and then you take your eyepiece holder off, and then you marry the camera and the telescope up together directly. That way you've got fewer layers of glass and you just get a crisper, cleaner image. For some telescopes, usually the kind of Newtonian telescopes, you need a 2x Barlow in order to achieve focus with a digital SLR. For the sun, that's not a problem. Every doubling in magnification will quarter the light getting through. So for deep sky stuff, using a Barlow is really not recommended. But for something as bright as the sun, it really isn't the problem. So there are a plethora of mobile phone adapters, universal ones where you can kind of align it so that your phone will always be lined up properly with the eyepiece. You can do that. You can also get these steady picks things for compact cameras where you kind of have it attached to the eyepiece and then you just put your camera on this movable bar so that you can get it perfectly lined up and then take your pictures. So that works really well because I have a zoom eyepiece and the camera has a digital zoom as well. So you can get some nice pictures that way. Prime focus, this is what a T-ring and an extension tube looks like. We've got the 2-inch one because on our refractor that we primarily use for imaging, we've completely removed the star diagonal. So we go straight into the back end of the telescope. The T-ring goes on in place of your camera lens and this screws onto that, but they're available with the small adapters as well. So with the refractor, we always go in like this. So the solar filter would be on the front and then this whole 2-inch tube just locks into the back of the refractor and then take pictures that way. The other way that you can do it is using the kind of really small 1.25" diameter extension tube. This has a low profile T-ring on, but you don't need that for doing this with a normal refractor. And that way you're not taking your diagonal off. So sometimes you can struggle a little bit to get focus, but the advantage that doing it with the 1.25" inch gives you is that you can put Barlow lenses in. You will be able to focus without a Barlow lens going straight into the back here, but if you want to get in a bit closer, you can double the magnification with a 2x Barlow 3 times with a 3x. If you've got really good seeing, you can use a 5x and you can really get in close to the sunspots then. And it's easy to switch the Barlows out if you're using this adapter. So it's just 2 different ways of working and either one works absolutely fine. So this is what the assembly looks like. If you are going to use a Barlow, you just screw the Barlow onto the end of one of these nose pieces, or you may have one that's got it kind of encased within a nose piece. Then if I'm putting that on our 2-inch refractor, then we basically use a little adapter that steps down. So it goes from 2-inch to 1.25" and then just put all that together and image that way. Now, obviously, if you add a Barlow into the mix, the focus is going to be in a totally different place because a Barlow gives you more in focus. But with this refractor, I can focus without a Barlow and all the way up to a 5x Barlow. So you are able to do that. Sometimes you need to put some extension tubes in just to pull you back a little bit more. But it all works incredibly well. And I've done loads of solar imaging that way. And that's what it looks like when it's all together. So I've done telescopically, I've photographed now quite a few partial eclipses. This one was 20th of March 2015, and I used my Helios refractor with my homemade Barda solar film, Canon 1100D. This was ISO 400, and I adjusted the exposures because it was cloudy. So I was having to just babysit and they were all fractions of a second, but when there was a lot of thin cloud around, I was just pushing up the shutter speed a bit. When there was a clear gap, I was pulling it back down again. So I was having to think on the fly. There really wasn't anything that I could do automatically here because the cloud level was changing so much. And you can see the difference in brightness when you've got thin cloud. even if it's cloudy, the sun can peek through quite a lot of clouds. So especially when you're magnifying it with a telescope, but you're going to have to babysit it and just look on the live view screen and make sure that you can see what you're doing, just so that you're not massively over or underexposing it. But even though it was the partial, it's still always amazing to see these different phases. And yeah, it was really good fun to do. So all of those were ISO 400, and it was just a case of adjusting the shutter speed based on what the light level was like due to cloud. In 2022, in October, we had a very small partial eclipse here. So this time I used a 70mm refractor with the 1000 oaks filter and the 1100D. So it was ISO 400 again. And again, dealing with lots of varying cloud levels, I was manually adjusting the exposure. I wanted to photograph this with our H alpha telescope as well, but I couldn't leave this for 1 second. I had to be there ready to take a picture as soon as there was a gap in the cloud, and I couldn't do that with 2 separate telescopes at once. So I just foregoed the H alpha stuff and just did it with this telescope because it was just easier. So yeah, that say ISO 400 just seems to be my go-to for solar pictures like that. Now we do have a hydrogen alpha Coronado PST telescope. This is a specially designed telescope that looks at the sun's chromosphere, the outer atmosphere. So that is a more dynamic part of the sun. You see more swirling. This is where you see prominences. You can see solar flares that way, filaments, and all of that exciting stuff. But they can be a bit of a nuisance to image with. So I am going to just talk you through how I do that. Now, another word of warning here, a hydrogen alpha solar telescope is not the same as a hydrogen alpha deep sky filter. So if you take photographs of nebulae and deep sky objects and you have one of these H alpha filters, please, please, please do not attempt to use it to photograph the sun or observe the sun. They are not the same thing. This thing has so many different components in it. It's got an etalon that tunes to a particular wavelength. It is not just a simple H alpha filter like that one. So yeah, they are definitely not the same thing. So please don't mix those up and try to do any solar imaging with one of these, because you will damage your camera or your eyesight quite quickly. Now, photographing through the Coronado PST with a digital SLR is kind of tricky, but I found a workflow that works. First of all, if you just put a digital SLR on here, you are not going to get focused. You need a Barlow in the imaging train, because there is not enough in focus on this telescope for the focus to work on that camera sensor. So you basically put a 2x Barlow in there. It gives you a bit more in focus, and you're then able to actually get focused, and it works really well. So I use a low profile T-ring. Probably not necessary, but we were trying to get the sensor as close as we possibly could to the telescope. So I've got the low profile T-ring, a Barlow, and I've got them both on a really short extension tube. And that works for me. And I've done a lot of imaging through it with that using my Canon 1100D. It's not the easiest setup to get good pictures out of, if I'm honest. So I'm going to just talk you through how I kind of made it work for me. I don't do it anymore because I use my ASI camera instead. But if you only have a digital SLR, here are some tips for how to make it work. Firstly, always shoot in RAW, because that's the highest quality. And I find that if I set my camera view to be mono, it's easier to focus. If you are photographing prominences and stuff like that, you might need a longer exposure because the stuff out here is fainter than the surface detail. But having the camera set to mono makes it so much easier to actually see the features, because in color, this is false color, by the way. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but the images straight off this telescope are bright pink. They are so flooded with pink and red light that basically it's really hard to see very well to focus. This is what they look like straight through the camera. It is so pink, and it's really, really difficult to actually see if you're in focus or not, because there's just so much light flooding there, so much color. You can see the amount of color around the limb. It's just really garish and quite difficult. If you have it in monochrome, it's a lot easier to see. What you then need to do is convert them into TIFF files, and then you can stack images using Registack 6 or AutoStack at 3 or 4. Now we've got AutoStack at 4. I forgot to change the number on this slide. Either one of those is great for stacking sun images, but they can't handle raw files, so you need to convert them into TIFFs first. You can do that with many different pieces of software. I always use Faststone Image Viewer. You can batch convert anything with that. So what I do when I'm processing these images, stacking will definitely give you better results, and I'll show you how that works in a second, like the before and after stacking. But what I do when I get the raw files out of the camera, they are all bright pink because raw files are color, even if you've set the camera to black and white. What I then do, the first step is to get all of the color gone, just take it all out so that I've got a monochrome image that I'm working with. And then I do all of my processing and stacking and stuff, and then I add the false color back in using Photoshop, and I find that I get a better result that way. You can sharpen the images using Registack 6, using the wavelets. Focus Magic and Topaz AI is good for sharpening, and so is Faststone Image Viewer, and that will just give you a little bit more crispness on those details. So you might think like stacking is for faint deep sky objects. Why would you want to stack something as bright as the sun? But it increases the signal to noise ratio. And even if you've got a lot of light like you do from the sun, you can benefit from having more signal and less noise. And it just builds up a way brighter, more detailed, more crisp image. So that is a single shot on this particular day with this monster filament. That filament was covering 2/3 of the diameter of the sun, absolutely huge. But the single shot of that, very blurry, very woolly, not the best. You can barely see these plages. The prominences are barely showing, but once I stacked, I believe this was 80 images thereabouts. I used to stack about 100 images or something like that and just analyze them and just stack the best percentage of that. And then you can see that there are loads more prominences that have popped out here that I hadn't noticed before. So it does give you a far better result. This day, this is still the biggest prominence that I've ever imaged. It was just phenomenal. And on the single shot, pretty impressive. But again, the stacked image, crisper. It's a workflow, takes a long time to do the converting and the stacking and the processing, but ultimately you'll get good results that way. When you're photographing the eclipse, you just basically want to capture the moon moving across the sun. So a single shot will be adequate. This is one of the last times I actually used my digital SLR to photograph the sun, and on this occasion got loads of really crisp details. Not perfect by a long way, but this aperture is tiny. The Coronado PST is like 40mm aperture, so it's a really small telescope, and it's the most budget-friendly H alpha scope on the market. So it's great to do any imaging with it, really. By far, the better images from that telescope come by using a CMOS or a CCD camera. So I always use the ASI120 MC camera now. It's a high frame rate camera, so you would be able to shoot a short video clip and stack them and not be affected by the speed that the moon is moving across the solar surface. So this is definitely the way to go. Like, I never use my digital SLR now because I just get such better results using this camera. So just as an example of what it can do with white light, this was like one of my best images taken with my Canon 1100D on the William Optics with the 1000 Oak solar filter. And on the right hand side here is using the ASI120 mono camera. We have a mono and a color, so on this day I actually used the mono one, which is why there's no color in the picture, but you can use Photoshop to artificially color it afterwards if you want to. But the detail that you can get on with that camera, just amazing. So there are 3 times more frames on this one stacked than on this one, but you can just see the surface detail so much better. Sunspots are crisper, just so much a better result with the CMOS camera than I can get with my SLR. And this was from 2022, where I added a Barda continuum filter into the imaging train, and that gives me these extra details. It makes everything just that little bit crisper. It's helping to filter out some of the atmospheric turbulence, and it's just gorgeous. So the downside of that filter is it makes everything green, so you do have to process that out afterwards, but really beautiful. And I use the mono camera for that as well. This time was the first light with the mono camera on the solar telescope, the PST, and straight away I was seeing far better detail than I could on the other times I'd done it with the digital SLR. This is the monochrome version, then artificially colored in Photoshop. So that was my very first go with that camera, and straight away the amount of detail was so much better. So good. So some tips for doing CMOS photography with that telescope. Mono is best for sure. You'll get a higher res, but the color one works fine, because even with the color one, I always I take away the color in processing, artificially put it back in afterwards. So I desaturate as step one of my processing, just as routine. Using sharp cap to capture the detail, I always use sharp cap, but you can use fire capture. You'll have the view on your laptop screen, and then you'll be able to kind of set your exposure according to the light levels and according to the aperture of the telescope that you're using. Then I normally shoot a 2000 frame video. You don't need to do longer than that, honestly. That's usually enough frames for solar. Auto stack at 4 is optimized for stacking video, and it stacks it super quickly. So I analyze it, stack the best percentage depending on what the scene conditions were like. And then again, sharpening, Registacks, wavelet sharpening, focus magic, topaz AI, fast-on image viewer sharpening is quite good. Lightroom is good. And then you can do all your other processing just to kind of add contrast, sharpen a bit more, just, add the color, whatever you want to do, really. This is a raw video. This is what the video looks like with my ASI color camera, the 120 MC. And you can see all the atmosphere shimmering. You can see there's a prominence there, but it's flooded with color. Can't see an awful lot of detail. The whole thing is shimmering and very hazy. But when you stack it and do all the processing steps I just talked about, you then get a crisper result. This telescope is never going to produce award-winning images, but I have heard so many people say you cannot image with the PST. You totally can. I've done so much imaging with this telescope. I love it. I really, really love our PST. I don't think they get enough love. And so hopefully that will help you if you was thinking about imaging with the PST. For the Eclipse, quite honestly, I just wouldn't, because it's so much extra work to get images that look good through that telescope that I kind of probably just wouldn't. I would just go with white light myself. If I had enough hands and enough brain power, I would do both, but I would always go with white light as my primary source of eclipse images. Just my preference. So looking back at the eclipse pictures that we did take in 2017, what things would I do differently next time? People always say, would you do fewer cameras next time? Absolutely not. I really love all the different aspects of the eclipse that we caught. And if anything, I would add extra cameras because there were things that I ended up missing, such as shadow bands. I really wanted to look for shadow bands. So I would like to have a camera filming a video of a white piece of cloth as we approached totality to see if we could capture shadow bands. I did lay down something white, but totally forgot to look at it because we were so kind of caught up in the whole experience. More bracketing for sure. I think I could have really pushed my exposures up a bit more if I had had access to a tripod for those totality images. I would have got more earth shine and more detail even further out on the corona. It extends out a really long way, so if you can do longer exposures, you will get more. If I was doing it handheld again, I don't think I could go much longer than I did, but more bracketing is always a good thing. You've got more to work with then. So definitely the longer exposure during totality to get earth shine is up there as one of the things I really wish I could have done. Yeah, longer exposure on the wide field would be really good, just so that I've got some foreground in there, because at the moment, like, my picture is just jet black in the background. So taking an exposure without the filter on, try and get some kind of daylight stuff and then merge those together so that I've got the eclipse but also a foreground thing. I know there's a fine line between kind of fake image and what capturing something that looks a bit like what you saw, but I would like to have had some foreground. The other thing is more footage of us. There's quite a few videos online of the 2017 eclipse where people have set up a GoPro and just filmed everybody watching and doing things, and it has audio so you can hear people cheering and clapping, and we don't have any of that. I didn't even set up a voice recorder. I would next time probably take a USB voice recorder and just have it recording just the general atmosphere, because it was really very, very special. And I've got nothing audible to remind me of it. I've got nothing visual of how we reacted. I mean, nobody wants to see a video of me ugly crying, because that's what I was doing, but I think just seeing us prepping and getting excited and getting ready would have been really special, and I don't have that. So definitely more cameras to capture something like that next time. And yeah, that's it. So I hope you found that really helpful. Good luck if you are going to go and see the eclipse. I hope you have clear weather. Whatever you're doing, imaging or observing wise, please keep your eyes very, very safe. If you're in any doubt as to the safety of your equipment, don't take a chance. You get one pair of eyes, you need to look after them. So if you think you've got a solar filter and it's a bit old and you're not sure if it's still intact, please just don't risk it. Use a projection method instead, and just make sure you're not damaging your eyes or your camera. So yeah, good luck with the weather, good luck with the eclipse, and just good luck with the solar imaging in general. I know this has been requested many, many times, so I hope it was useful. I will timestamp everything in the description box below so that you can refer back to the bits that were of particular interest to you. Thanks for watching, guys. Bye for now. You are outrageous. Wait, what does an orange cat have to do with eclipses? Come here, pumpkin. Oh, look at Jack. Look at Jack. There we go. Happy now. You're happy now. Yeah, you're dribbling all down my shoulder, aren't you? Of course, every eclipse tutorial needs a dribbling orange cat on their shoulder.